Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, honoring Arbor Day on April 26th, with an ongoing commitment to sustainable stewardship and conservation of Missouri's forests. ChooseWood.com.
Welcome to St. Louis on the Air. I'm Sarah Fenske. If you've seen the new Netflix series Self-Made, you might think you know something about Madam C.J. Walker. She was a washerwoman in early 1900s St. Louis, and she became the wealthiest woman of her day by launching a hair care empire. To do so, she battled not only prejudice, but also her arch rival, Annie Malone. When she moved to Indianapolis, Annie followed, tormenting her just like a soap opera villain. Well, as you might guess, that's just the Netflix version. In real life, there wasn't even an Annie Malone. The character is a highly fictionalized version of St. Louis's beloved Annie Malone, and Annie Malone never moved to Indianapolis. So, joining us today to tell us the true story behind the Netflix series Self-Made is Alelia Bundles. She is a public speaker and a former television executive and producer and journalist. And she is both the great-granddaughter of Madam C.J. Walker and her biographer. So, Alelia, welcome to the show.
Delighted to be with you.
And we're also joined today by Brent Leggs. He is the executive director of the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund for the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Brent, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
And finally, we're joined today by Gwen Moore. She is the curator of urban landscape and community identity for the Missouri Historical Society. Gwen, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
Alelia, let's start with you. You literally wrote the book on your great-grandmother's remarkable life. So who, in a nutshell, was the real Madam C.J. Walker?
So Madam Walker is a woman who moved to St. Louis in the late 1880s when she was a widowed 20-year-old with a daughter and joined her brothers who were barbers in St. Louis and really benefited from being in that community from the women of the church at St. Paul AME, and who then transformed herself after having been a washerwoman until she was 38 into a successful entrepreneur who employed thousands of women, became a philanthropist, a political activist, and a patron of the arts.
And she was a really big deal. I've seen some accounts that suggest that she was the wealthiest African-American woman of her day and maybe for many days after that. What's the sense of just how much money this company made?
Well, I think a lot of people kind of get into what my friend Tyrone McKinley Freeman calls the millionaire sweepstakes, and that actually is not that important to me. Who was first and all of that. The way that I measure her life is the women that she employed and the generational wealth that she created and all of the other good deeds. But in fact, with Madam Walker's life, when Madam Walker died, because we're really fortunate to have thousands of pages of records and letters and photographs, we actually can calculate her net worth. And so when she died, her personal estate, assets, jewelry, cars, etc., worth between $600,000 and $700,000. The value of her company, had she sold it on the day she died, would have been between $1 and $2 million based on the last 2 years of the sales and the year after her death. So in one of those years, her sales were almost $600,000.
And this was someone who had been born into some great poverty and right after the Civil War. Is that correct?
First child in her family born free on a plantation in Delta, Louisiana, right across the river from Vicksburg. So, yes, she was born into great poverty, into an area that had been devastated during the Civil War.
Now, Brett, you work for the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and your organization recently published an interview with Alelia illuminating some of the areas where the Netflix series differs from real life when it comes to Madam C.J. Walker. Why was that something that was important to your organization?
Yeah, so the National Trust in 2014, we partnered with the former owners of the estate, Ambassador Harold E. Doley Jr. and his wife, Helena, to protect the estate in perpetuity. And through our partnership, both with Alelia and others, we now hold a preservation easement on our first African-American National Historic Landmark in the United States. And this ensures that no future owner can demolish the building or negatively alter the building. And we did this just because the building was architecturally significant or historically significant, but this place called Villa Lawaro, it stands as a lasting testimony and reminder of Madam Walker's remarkable life and the entrepreneurial spirit that many Black women had in the 20th century. Mm-hmm. So we partnered to ensure that that place stands forever, that the current property owner can develop a viable plan for reuse and interpretation. And the big goal is that more Americans will be able to tour and interact with this physical history and fully understand the real Madam Walker. Mm-hmm. And so that was partly the intent for us collaborating with Alelia to tell the story.
And this estate, I mean, this building is gorgeous, and it's also, I guess you could say, it's over the top. Like, this is certainly a testament to just how far this woman had come from her humble beginnings. This is a mansion.
It is a mansion, and so a lot of my work is deeply rooted in identifying, documenting, and helping communities to preserve African American historic places. And as you can imagine, many Black historic spaces are unadorned, simple, historic buildings. But when you have the opportunity to see a place with its grandness and beauty, the elegance that is embodied within Villa Lawaro, it is of exceptional significance. It's a rare archetype in American history. And I believe that we could argue that it is one of the most significant women's history sites in America. Mm-hmm. And it's hard to find a place that is both historically significant associated to a Black woman, but the building is also significant to a Black architect. Villa Lawaro was designed by Vertner Tandy, first licensed Black architect in the state of New York. So for many reasons, this place is really important.
Now, in addition to being the story of one Black woman, Self-Made also gets into another Black woman entrepreneur, and that's somebody who's based on Annie Malone, who is a name that's familiar to many St. Louisans. And Gwen, that's one of the reasons we wanted to also invite you to join this conversation, is that for those of us in St. Louis, Annie Malone is a name you hear so many times. What are some of the parts of her legacy that are still around town today?
Well, first of all, we have the Annie Malone Family and Children's Services Center, which is the original colored orphan home that became named after Annie Malone because she donated the money and the land for the building of the colored orphan's home. And she was on the executive board for many, many years. And so they decided to honor her. They would name the Annie Malone home after her. We have that annual parade every year that honors Annie Malone and helps to raise funds for the Annie Malone Family and Children's Center. So those are two things that's part of the legacy. I always say that one of the tragedies here in St. Louis is that we did not preserve Poro College, which she built in 1918 and was one of the first buildings of its kind built by a Black woman. It was Poro College, but it was also a complex. There were auditoriums, there were restaurants, there was the famous roof garden. It was in DeVille at St. Ferdinand and Pendleton. When she left St. Louis, of course, in 1930 and moved to Chicago, the building was still there. It went into it was bought in I think 1937 by the Mississippi Valley Company. And then it was unfortunately it was razed, which is a real tragedy because it's such a historic building, and it would have been such an important part of her legacy to have that brick and mortar building here. But she was, her life in a way really parallels, I think, Madam Walker's. I think Ms. Bundles would probably agree that they were both women born in not of any means. They were self-made. She lost her parents at an early age. She was the youngest of 11 siblings, and she was raised by her older sister and her other siblings. I think it's interesting that she moved to, she was born in Metropolis, Illinois, right outside Metropolis, Illinois, and eventually moved to Brooklyn, Illinois. At that time, it was called Lovejoy, which was founded by another black woman, another amazing black woman, Priscilla Baltimore. So it's all this rich black history of black women. And like Madam C.J. Walker, she was a race woman. This was a time in history where the whole black community was infused with ideas of self-help, race advancement, uplifting the race, and that's what these two women believed in. They believed that their wealth had to be used to help other black people, particularly black women. So they had a feminist consciousness and a race consciousness.
Now, the film, the Netflix series, shows Madam Walker getting her start by selling products for Annie Malone. Alelia, do we know if that's how Madam Walker did first get into the hair care industry?
So, yes, she definitely was a Malone agent, and I was able to do some of the first primary source research that documented that when Madam Walker left St. Louis and moved to Denver, that she was selling Poro products, which she sold for probably a year to a year and a half. I think that she first learned about hair care from her brothers who were barbers, and people who know, and the Missouri Historical Society helped me document that because they're listed in the city directories, in the St. Louis city directories in the 1880s as barbers.
Wow.
So I think she learned about barbering or learned about hair care through them. She then sold Malone's products, and then when she was in Denver, she worked as a cook for a pharmacist who had the largest pharmacy west of the Mississippi River, and he was familiar with products that had been made before Madam Walker made her products and before Malone made her products that had similar formulas.
Okay. And so that's the true story of how Madam Walker got started. And we're going to need to take a quick break here. But when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about the relationship between these two women and some of the heavy fictionalization that went into this Netflix series. So our guests today are Gwen Moore of the Missouri Historical Society. We're also talking to Alelia Bundles, who's the biographer and great-granddaughter of Madam C.J. Walker. And we're joined by Brent Leggs of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. We need to take a quick break, and we'll be back shortly to continue this conversation. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio, 90.7 KWMU.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, honoring Arbor Day on April 26th, with an ongoing commitment to sustainable stewardship and conservation of Missouri's forests. ChooseWood.com.
And now back to our conversation. We're talking about the Netflix series Self-Made, which explores the life of African-American entrepreneur Sarah Breedlove, better known as Madam C.J. Walker. Our guests today are experts in her life and legacy. That includes Gwen Moore, the curator of urban landscape and community identity for the Missouri Historical Society, and Brent Leggs, the executive director of the African-American Cultural Heritage Action Fund for the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And last but certainly not least, Alelia Bundles, who is Madam C.J. Walker's biographer and also her great-granddaughter. Now, one part of the Netflix series I wanted to talk with my guests about has to do with how Madam Walker got her start selling products for the Annie Malone character. And as Alelia explained just now, it does seem that that is how she got her start. But in the Netflix series, the Annie Malone character says flat out that women won't buy these hair products from someone who looks like Madam Walker. And in the film, Madam Walker goes around her back and proves her wrong. Let's listen to a scene where Madam Walker, then still going by Sarah Breedlove, announces that she's managed to sell these hair care products.
Sarah, what are you doing here?
I did it. I sold 20 tins.
What now?
I borrowed a few tins of your hair grower.
After I told you no?
Just to see if I could sell them.
But you can't. It don't make sense.
I figured if I just showed you.
You stole from me? After everything I've done for you?
No, I would never steal from you. I brought all the money, it's all for
I
you.
got you back on your feet. I confided in you. How could you?
I just wanted to show you that I can sell. And we can make a lot of money together. I got some ideas.
Are you out of your mind? Even in your Sunday best, you look like you just stepped off the plantation. These are my products, and I will not have the likes of you associated with them.
And that's from the new Netflix series Self-Made. Now, Gwen, the Addie Monroe character, is a real viper. Was that the case for Annie Malone in real life?
I've heard that the filmmaker said that this wasn't really Annie Malone; it was a composite. But when I first saw the film, I said, I thought I didn't hear right because they said Addie Monroe. I said, oh, no, that's Annie Malone. That was not Annie Malone. It's a fictionalized version, and I don't think it doesn't comport with who this woman really was at all. Absolutely not.
Now, in the film, this character suggests that people buy her hair products because they want to look like a biracial woman, like she is in the film. Was Annie Malone biracial?
No, she was not.
Okay.
No, she was. People describe her. She was. If you saw her, you would say this is a black woman. You would not have thought this is a highly light-skinned woman or this is a mixed race woman. She looked like. Well, you can't see me, but she looked like me, and Miss Bundles.
So she's certainly not somebody who would have gone around saying bad things about women who were not biracial. That's clearly a Netflix imagination.
Yeah, that's fiction.
Lelia, was there a falling out between these two women when Madam C.J. Walker started her own company and ended up becoming such a success?
Well, yes, there is something that created a rift between the two women, and they parted ways. But I just have to agree with Ms. Moore. This is a character that the head writer and the showrunners invented, and they wanted to develop these themes. They have said of colorism, and I cringed when I just heard that particular clip. I've always thought of Annie Malone as Madam. The two women were equals. They were rivals, but they were equals, and they both did a lot for the community. So this portrayal is not something that I certainly, agree with. I just have to just say that really frankly.
Sure.
That Annie Malone is a hero, not just in St. Louis, but to many people who understand that both women were really successful entrepreneurs. But yes, there was a falling out when Sarah Breedlove moved to Denver and her good friend Charles Joseph Walker joined her from St. Louis. She began to make her own products. And I found like a newspaper, some letters to the editor with some of Madam Walker's customers saying, we didn't know about Annie Malone before you moved here, and we love Sarah. So it got to be kind of a personal, petty thing in a way. But she wanted to be her own boss, and so that's what she did. She started her own company.
Now, in terms of some of the hurdles that she faced in order to do this, we know now that this Addie Monroe character following her around the country, taunting her, that is purely fiction. But what were some of the big roadblocks she had to overcome to get this company to what it was?
So she said, first of all, it was some of the people closest to her who told her she wouldn't succeed. And I think that's why people who have watched it, when they if you can put aside the fictionalized Addie Monroe character and the over-dramatization, it really is a story of a woman overcoming her own personal insecurities and empowering other women, helping to develop a business. And she would say the first thing you have to do is have a great product, and then you have to advertise it. And she spent most of the year on the road training women, making speeches, and helping people to become leaders. She had a really great ability to surround herself with really talented executives. Her executive C-suite, as we would call it now, were people like F.B. Ransom, who is portrayed in the film. But it does leave out other mentors of hers from St. Louis, like Jessie Batts Robinson, who was a school teacher and a member of St. Paul AME, and whose husband, C.K. Robinson, was editor of a newspaper. So there were other women who mentored her. So she was fortunate to have that mentoring. She could model herself after women's organizations like the National Association of Colored Women and like the Court of Calamity with the Women's Auxiliary of the Knights of Pythias, and then use those examples and turn around and empower other women and organize them.
And one of the things I wanted to make sure that we got a chance to touch on in our last couple minutes here, and that is that not only has this brand come back, I understand with your blessing, but that the Madam C.J. Walker brand is now also tied in to the owners of her former estate. Brent, can you help us understand the connections there?
Yeah. So in December 2018, Villa Awara was purchased by the New Voices Foundation under the leadership of entrepreneur Richard Lou Dennis. And Mr. Dennis, he resurrected Madam Walker's dormant legacy business, created a partnership with Sephora, currently selling products under Madam C.J. Walker's name, which is fantastic. And the foundation, they envision reusing Villa Awara as a center for female entrepreneurship to create a unique space for women of color to build on the remarkable life and legacy of Madam C.J. Walker.
Alelia, that's got to be so exciting. First, that work, but also then the fact that now your great-grandmothers, that there are products now, again, using this brand name.
Well, yeah, it really is a moment where all of these things are coming together with the products at MCJW. But also one of the things Ms. Moore was saying is like having this tangible evidence where where Poro College was torn down in Indianapolis, the Madam Walker Legacy Center, also a National Historic Landmark, still stands. It was built in 1927. But this allows us to tell the story, and I think it really is a case to encourage people to keep their records for historic preservation societies to preserve buildings, because once that tangible evidence is gone, it becomes very, very difficult to tell the stories of these great people.
And Gwen, last question here. I know you mentioned to our producer there's a couple books you wanted to recommend for people who'd want to know more about the real Madam C.J. Walker. Could you just tell us those couple books you'd want to make sure that we know about today?
No, the book that I would really recommend is Amelia Bundle's book. I was just telling her before we got started, I read her book when it first came out. It has become an invaluable reference work. It is meticulously researched.
And so that's a rave from one guest to another guest. That book is.
I tell people, I recommend this book to people, and I tell them, hey, don't be kind of put off by all the footnotes. It reads like a novel. It is just an amazing book. She talks a lot about St. Louis and Annie Malone, and that is the book. Now, there was another book that came out a little later by Beverly Lowry that also talks about Madam C.J. Walker. But Amelia Bundle's book is the standard.
Okay.
It's the gold standard.
And that's called On Her Own Ground, The Life and Times of Madam C.J. Walker.
Haven't they renamed it?
Right. So in order to use the movie tie-in art with Octavia Spencer on the cover, it's now called Self-Made.
Okay. And I do want to thank all my guests for their time today. We are out of time, but Gwen Moore, Brent Leggs, and Alelia Bundles, thank you so much for joining us. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio, 90.7 KWMU.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, honoring Arbor Day on April 26th, with an ongoing commitment to sustainable stewardship and conservation of Missouri's forests. ChooseWood.com.